Hi, and welcome to Life, Leadership and Change. I'm your host, Cara Hawkins. This show is built around three big topics: who we are, how we lead, and the world we're creating together. In each episode, I sit down with entrepreneurs, creatives, academics, and changemakers from around the globe to share real stories and insights about inner growth, purposeful leadership, and shaping bigger systems for the better. Whether you're here for the big systemic questions, the deeply personal ones, or the parts in between, there's something in here for you. Now, this is the second of two bonus Q&A episodes following the 4-part mini-series on complexity leadership that I ran with my guest, Dr. Aiden Thornton. Please feel free to check out those episodes if you haven't listened yet, or you can jump straight in. Enjoy. Welcome back, Aiden. Thank you so much for joining me again for our second Q&A around our mini-series. Today, we're talking about some of the more conceptual questions that came up from our mini-series, Rising to the Occasion, focusing on complexity leadership and some related topics. Yeah. And I was really interested that a lot of our questions came in around the topic of truth, which I know a really big topic. So I want to just hand over to you to sort of give a bit of an introduction to that before we dive into the questions.
It's such an important point. I think truth is something that's hidden in plain sight, and you don't necessarily see people sitting around cafes talking about truth very much. But when the topic comes up, I think people start to recognize how important it is. And, I just in terms of framing for today's conversation, I do think it's important just to recognize that in our what was it, episode 4, we barely scratched the surface about truth. And as I think you said very correctly at the start of that episode, philosophers have been talking about the nature of truth, the importance of truth for thousands of years. And so there's no way that we can do justice to the whole topic within 45 minutes. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge some of the things that we didn't talk about in relation to truth. So we didn't talk about the difference between analytic truths versus synthetic truths. We didn't talk about the difference between a claim being true versus knowing whether a claim is true. We didn't talk about the types of claims that need to be true. We didn't talk about the types of claims that may turn out to be objectively true but are nevertheless inconsequential. We didn't talk about the difficulty, sometimes the great difficulty, working out whether more complex claims are true of the world. For example, claims we make about psychological or behavioral or social or cultural phenomena. The claims that we talked about in episode 4 were fairly simple ones, like, is the earth round or flat, or is it sunny outside my window, and what have you. Those things are fairly easy to establish. Well, actually, the shape of the earth wasn't so easy to establish, as it turns out. But looking outside my window to find out whether it's sunny is fairly easy to do. But claims about psychological and behavioral and social and cultural types of phenomena can often be much more challenging to work out whether or not they're true of the world. And we also didn't talk about some of the challenges with the correspondence theory of truth, even though I think the correspondence theory of truth is the most we could ever hope for. So, I think it's just an important framing for our conversation about truth. And in my view, truth is a topic that is not only important, but I think it's kind of neglected in some ways, you know? Over the past 10, 15 years or whatever, I've spoken about truth quite a lot. And I think some people are kind of caught off guard by that in some ways. And yet, once we start getting into the conversation, I think many people, not everyone, but many people start recognizing why this really does matter. So anyway, I just wanted to put some of those ideas on the table.
No, thank you. I think that's a great framing and a great start. And also, I just wanted to reiterate as well how truth has fitted into this conversation around complexity leadership as well. And what you've emphasized, Aiden, has been, from my understanding, we need to be able to understand what is true and to identify truth in order to effectively lead through complexity. And that's why truth is such a big part of this conversation. Would you agree with that framing of it?
Yeah, why? Yes, I would tweak that just a little bit to say I think having a mature understanding of truth is a necessary condition to engage in the science and practice of complexity leadership, so that we can understand what's truly complex about the world, how leaders can be most effective in navigating those different types of complexities, and so on. Now, of course, the counter argument here is, well, things are so complex, there's just no way of knowing whether some things are true. And that can also be the case. But I think even in those contexts, we're still trying to approximate an understanding of what's true so that we can navigate those
Mm.
approximations, we can navigate those complex conditions accordingly. I mean, I can't imagine how anyone could approach a complex situation and say, oh, we don't really care what's true about this situation. We don't care what's complex about the situation. We're not seeking to understand it. We're not seeking to make sense of it. We're not seeking to understand the conditions that are influencing it, but we're just going to try and do our best to navigate it somehow. To me, that just doesn't make any sense. And in our last conversation, I said that one of my concerns was bad advice on complexity leadership. And for me, that's really tethered to our conversation about truth, because I think there are all sorts of claims being made in the market and in, practitioner white papers and some science, some scientific kind of claims or scientific sounding claims that are being made um, that nevertheless may compound the issue and actually create unnecessary levels of complexity and may prevent leaders from navigating complexity effectively.
So maybe is an analogy for that, it's very hard to solve a problem if you don't actually understand what the problem is and the effectiveness of the different tools at hand. And
Yeah.
so truth is part of really understanding the truth of the problem and the truth of the effectiveness of the various tools you can navigate the problem
Yeah,
with.
well, at least to try to approximate that, yes. Now, of
Mm,
course, things get a lot more complex. I mean, even just take something like leadership. As I said in a podcast probably a couple of years ago, it's almost unfathomable how many things are having an impact on whether or not leadership emerges moment by moment. There's biological factors, psychological factors, behavioral factors, evolutionary factors, interpersonal factors, systemic factors, cultural, ethical. All of these things are probably have some role to play in whether leadership is emerging moment by moment. And it's beyond well, I think it's beyond the human brain or most human brains, and it's beyond our research methods to understand what all of those things are, how they're contributing, how they're interacting, and what have you. So we don't necessarily have all the tools available to model the complexity or to thoroughly understand the complexity, but at least I think we can put our best foot forward in terms of trying to approximate an understanding of the complexity so that we can act most effectively and most wisely.
mm, mm. I couldn't agree more. And I think on that note, let's dive into some of these fantastic questions that have come through.
Sure. Okay, cool.
So, question one, and this is based on episode 4 around truth. So, that was our focus of episode 4. So, if you want to go take a re listen, then you can do that on the same platform that you're listening from here. But in itself, this question is still very interesting to explore without that context as well. And that question is, are you saying that there is only one truth?
Yeah. This is a question I get a lot, actually, and I'm not sure that I really understand what it means to say that there's one truth. To be honest, what I'm saying is that truth is objective and truth is important, and we have a moral obligation to either identify truth or at least approximate it. I'm not even sure that I know what it means to suggest that there's only one truth. So let me give you an example. So I'll share 4 claims with you. So claim number 1 is 2 plus 2 equals 4. Claim 2 is the earth is round and not flat. Claim 3 is conscientiousness is a strong predictor of effective leadership. And claim 4 is emotional intelligence is a weak predictor of effective leadership. Now, I would contend that all 4 of those claims are true of the world. So I don't understand in what sense there could be one of them, because there's many claims that are true of the world. So then I have to think about how do I interpret this question? Am I saying there's only one truth? So maybe what this person is actually asking is, am I saying that there's only one world? And if that's what they mean, then yes, I think there's one world in the sense that we all live on the same planet at the same point in time. We're breathing the same oxygen. We're subject to the same laws of physics, even if we don't know about those laws of physics. So anytime we make a claim about the world, that claim needs to be reconciled against the one world that all of us occupy. I think maybe that's one way of interpreting that question. Or another way of interpreting that question is perhaps what this person is asking is whether there's only one way of looking at things. And quite clearly, no, there are many, maybe infinitely many ways of looking at things, but some of those ways of looking at things will yield claims that are true of the world. Some of those ways of looking at things will yield claims that are false of the world. So To my mind, it seems very reasonable to think that there's one world that we all inhabit. There are many true claims about that world. There are many false claims about that world. But I still don't know really what it means to suggest that there's only one truth.
Can I ask one follow-up question on that?
Yeah,
And this is just my interpretation of the question.
yeah,
Take your example of conscientiousness as a strong predictor of effective leadership.
yeah.
Is it possible that I think maybe the question is there possible that there are multiple truths of that statement? So perhaps that statement is true in some contexts, but there are different truths in different contexts.
What would those other truths be?
Maybe
It's
that's
more
not the right example, but there might. I think what I took from that is on any question or on any topic, is there just one objective truths, or is it possible there are different truths for different circumstances or contexts or situations?
There could absolutely be different truths for different contexts and different circumstances, but I think that would all be built into the claim. So, for example, does culture moderate the relationship between conscientiousness and effective leadership? And therefore, maybe conscientiousness is a really strong predictor for some cultures and a weaker predictor for other cultures. Sure, yeah, for sure. But for me, that's just part of a well-specified claim that really what you're saying is something is the case in this context and something else is the case in that context. Well, both of those things can be evaluated as to whether or not they're objectively true of the world. Um,
Okay,
yeah,
so
so,
maybe more about how specific the claim is, and
yeah,
if it's general, then we might not be able to say it is a blanket truth. But if we become more specific, then we might be able to find more nuanced claims that are more accurate or aligned with the truth.
yeah. Well, and so this is the difference between a claim like "It's sunny outside my window right now," which is fairly straightforward, versus saying something like "Conscientiousness is a strong predictor of effective leadership." So when we're making the second kind of claim, which is a much more kind of psychological and social claim, we have to work a lot harder to specify the claim that we're making. So, for example, conscientiousness. Okay, well, how are we defining conscientiousness? Okay, well, effective leadership. How are we defining effective leadership? Okay, well, how are we measuring conscientiousness? How are we measuring effective leadership? What kind of relationship are we looking for between conscientiousness and effective leadership? So, of course, when it gets to these much more complex claims, we need to do a lot more work in terms of specifying the exact claim that we're making. So, if you make like a general sweeping claim like conscientiousness is, a strong predictor of effective leadership, then then I think we need to think carefully about that, right? Because I mean, if you just do one study on it and find that one way of defining conscientiousness, one way of measuring conscientiousness, one way of defining effective leadership, one way of measuring effective leadership, and they're related, well, sure, that's one finding. But the thing is, when it comes to something like personality studies and leadership and what have you, we've got, I don't know, 80 years or thereabouts, maybe not quite 80 years, and up to 80 years of information about this. So we've got multiple definitions of conscientiousness, multiple ways of measuring it. And when you look over an entire body of knowledge, then yes, the general pattern is that conscientiousness is a strong predictor of effective leadership. Yes, so that is true. But we need to build up an entire body of knowledge and be really precise about our claims in order to know whether or not that claim is true of the world.
Okay, so I think then if we're looking at is there only one truth? From what I'm taking from what you've said is that there is always an objective truth, and often it's actually how specific and nuanced we are with the claim that reflects, there's still is still that one truth, but let's not have high level blanket generalizations presuming to be truth when there is actually more nuance to a claim, and we just need to get more specific with the claim to make sure it is true, but there still remains only one truth on any claim.
Yeah, I mean, we need to be specific enough with the claim in order to evaluate it and
Yeah.
know whether or not it's true of the world. And then we need to make sure that we're not making broad sweeping overgeneralizations. So, for example, if I make if let's just say I'm standing in the middle of the United States, and I make the claim I'm currently standing in an individualistic culture, and then I go somewhere like, let's say, Japan or China, and I say, I'm currently standing in an individualistic culture. Well, I'm making the same claim, but those claims have fundamentally different truth values, right? If I say it in the United States, it seems to be true. And if I say it in Japan, it would seem to be false. So we just need to be clear about what's the scope of the claim, right? which is why I think we need to specify things like in this culture or, whatever.
Yeah, and making sure that there's enough information to be
Mm,
able to validate that claim, I presume, because, there won't be data
right.
or information to be able to confirm that on everything, obviously.
Exactly. Yeah,
Mm.
exactly. But notwithstanding all of that, though, I still think that that truth has to be objective, and I
Mm.
think it's very hard to make sense of make sense of the postmodern interpretation that we talked about in episode 4, which is more kind of relativistic, where truth is somehow subjective, and what's true for me may be false for you, or what's true for my culture may be false for your culture. To me, that's the thing that doesn't make sense.
Mm. Well, I think it's also possibly a distinction between what's a value and what's a truth. And I think
Yeah,
it's possibly more the semantics that have been a little blurred
yeah,
for the use of the word truth, perhaps.
yeah. I agree. Yeah. And just to anchor that back in the language we use in episode 4, I would say that what is believed by one culture may not be believed by another culture. What is meaningful to one culture may not be meaningful to another culture. And that's fine. I think most people would accept that. But that has nothing to do with what's true of the world.
Mm, mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, that links in really nicely with our second question, which says, when you talk about truth, are you only talking about scientific truth?
Yes. Okay. So no, I'm not talking about scientific truth. That's also another question. Sorry, I shouldn't have said yes to start that. To in response. No, I'm not saying. I'm not talking about scientific truth. Here's another question that I get a lot. So I'm not talking about scientific truth, mostly because I don't think there is any such thing as scientific truth, in contrast to all of those other types of truth out there. And I think I would have enormous difficulty talking about things that I don't believe in. So my concern with the term scientific truth is that it's conflating the method, i.e., science, with the status of a claim, i.e., whether or not it's true. And I think these two things need to be separated rather than brought together and conflated. So let's take each one of them individually, right? So we'll take the science part of the term scientific truth. Well, first of all, I mean, as someone who engages in scientific method on almost a daily basis, science is not in the business of revealing truth to the world. The way science works is we say, okay, well, here's a summary of what we know so far. Based on what we know, here's a new idea to test. And we'll test this new idea with a bunch of fresh evidence and using new analytical tools and whatnot. And either this idea or this hypothesis was supported or it wasn't supported. And then often we end up making a claim about the world. So a final sentence in a paper or one of the final paragraphs will say, oh, well, based on the research that we've done, things are probably like X. So science definitely makes claims, but the mere fact that the claim was yielded by science doesn't guarantee that it's true. Some scientific claims are true if they correspond to the world. Some scientific claims are false if they don't correspond to the world. And there are many scientific claims that haven't corresponded to the world because there's lots of ways to do science badly, right? I mean, you can have badly framed hypotheses, you can have a non-representative or a lousy sample, you can be using a weak measurement instrument, you can do the analysis poorly, you can not understand how to interpret the analysis, and the list goes on and on and on. So the mere fact that a claim is yielded by science doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, in my view. So let's go to the truth part of the term scientific truth, okay? So let's say you and I wanted to predict the weather tomorrow, right? And we decided to consult the rune stones. So we cast the rune stones and we made a prediction about the temperature, the humidity, the cloud coverage, and a bunch of other stuff. And comes to tomorrow, and lo and behold, we accurately predicted all of those things. It was absolutely spot on, right? Well, I would say that our prediction was true in the sense that our prediction corresponded to the actual weather on the day, even though the claim was yielded by the runestones and not by science. So, in the correspondence theory of truth, which again, I think has limitations, but I think it's still the best way of thinking about truth, is that there's only one thing and one thing only that determines whether something is true, and that is whether it corresponds to the world, or corresponds to a state of affairs in the world. The method used to yield that claim might increase our confidence in the claim, but it doesn't make it more true.
And so what I'm hearing then is perhaps the understanding of how you've defined the correspondence theory has possibly been interpreted as, oh, okay, that means science because we need to use, for example, scientific methods to confirm that something is true. But actually, the correspondence theory is about corresponding with the world and not necessarily just the method. So there are
Yeah.
multiple methods we can use to confirm that something corresponds with the world, but the scientific method is probably one that is used a lot.
Yeah, well, the scientific method is a particularly robust way of doing it, but just think about daily examples, right? Think of crossing the road. So I'm on one side of the road and I make the claim, oh, the road's clear, it's safe to cross. So I don't need a scientific study to work that out. I just glance this way and I glance that way and I glance back again the other way and I find out, is that claim true or false, right? Does that
Mm.
claim correspond to a state of affairs in which the road is actually clear to cross or it's not? Or just think about, oh, well, God, petrol prices have been increasing over the past couple of months. Well, again, I mean, you could do a scientific study on that, but I think most people who've got a car and a credit card would know that that's, probably true. And so I think that there's just a multitude of daily examples when we talk about truth, and we know perfectly well that we're talking about truth in the correspondence sense. So, I mean, even take an example. I experienced this yesterday, right? So here's an actual example. So I looked outside my window, so, oh, wow, it's kind of sunny today. It's kind of cool. I'll pop on some t-shirt and some shorts or whatever. Go outside. It's absolutely freezing. I couldn't have taken into account, the chill in the air or the breeze or, the intensity of the sun or what have you. And so my belief about the weather turned out to be false because it doesn't correspond to a state of affairs in the world. So I think everyday examples of, pretty much any
Mm.
time that we have a belief about something, I think we know perfectly well that we're talking about correspondence in the vast majority of cases.
If we, though, take that to complexity leadership and
Yeah.
maybe more complex examples,
Yeah.
for example, conscientiousness is an effective or a predictor of effective leadership.
Yeah.
Would you say that the more complex the examples, possibly the more frequently we do need to use, for example, the scientific method in order to confirm those truths because they are more complex?
Yeah, I think the more complex, yeah. So this is a great point. So the more complex the claim, I think the clearer we need to be on the claim in terms of operationalizing the claim. What are the definitions? What are the measures? All that kind of stuff. I think that's the first thing. Second thing is, yes, this is where I think science does come into play. And the third thing is we might also consider triangulating multiple methods. So this
Mm.
is, we talked about, I think in episode 3, something like the systemic racism claim, where yes, we can get a right balance between lived experience based on a representative sample, in addition to other kinds of systemic evidence. And so we can triangulate multiple pieces of evidence to evaluate whether or not that claim is true. And I think that's the kind of thing that we often need to do when it comes to complexity.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fantastic nuance. I really like that. And yeah, obviously very relevant to, I think, a lot of the challenges that people might be experiencing in their work as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think also actually nicely leads into the third question, which is around, or the question asked, don't postmodern and critical social justice worldviews reflect higher and more complex stages of adult development? Before we dive into that, could I just ask you to recap postmodern and critical social justice worldviews and perhaps introduce the stages of adult development for those who might not have heard of it before?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we probably need a conversation for a year to do justice to this one, but I'll give it a go. Um, Holy moly, where do we start? Okay, so let's start with stages of adult development. So the idea of stages of adult development is that there are stages or these sequences that people can develop over the course of the lifespan. And these stages reflect more development. So as you develop through each stage, you get more complexity or more maturity or more spirituality or a more refined understanding or more of something. And so there are some adult development theories, not all of them, and I do want to emphasize not all of them. There are some adult development theories that say that postmodernism is a higher stage of development than modernism. So what is modernism? So this is kind of associated with science and the Enlightenment and objective truth and we can understand the world through these methods of inquiry and what have you. Postmodern is this idea that there's no questions the legitimacy of meta narratives. There's not necessarily any such thing as objective truth, or even if there is such a thing as objective truth, it's not obtainable. And so all we can deal with are these warring narratives between people or between cultures, and there's no way of saying that one narrative is more true than another narrative. Um, so some adult development theories make a very specific claim. They're saying that there's this period of this period of pre-modernism before the Enlightenment in the 17th century. Then there was this period of modernism from the 17th century through to around about the 20th century. And then postmodernism emerged in, around about the 60s, 70s, 80s, and what have you, through various French philosophers and what have you. And then sometimes they go on to make other claims about postmodernism and what have you. And what they're saying is that postmodernism reflects a higher stage of development, in the sense that it has more complexity or more maturity or more development, more of something. It goes beyond the limits of modernism in a meaningful sense.
Hmm.
And you go, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just on the adult stages of development, just to flag my understanding at least as well, is that not the assumption is not that everyone goes through every stage of development. So
Yeah.
some people do, but some people, stay in different stages. So what I understand is what you're saying, this idea that postmodernism is a more developed stage indicates that people with those views might think in more complex ways or something, which will sort of have a little bit superior sort of tinge to it.
Yes, that can sometimes be the case, but again, that doesn't generalize to all adult developmentalists or adult development theories. Yeah. Um, so I think what we're doing here is we're evaluating the claim: is postmodernism a higher stage of development or a later stage of development than modernism? And
Yeah.
in summary, my view is that is a completely and utterly unfounded claim. And in fact, I think this is one of the biggest mistakes that the adult development community has made, because I think what they're doing is they're conflating periods of time with developmental stages. So
Mhm.
it's certainly true. It is true that postmodernism occurred after modernism in a temporal sense. Yes, it occurred after it, but that does not entail the conclusion that modernism is a higher stage of development that somehow transcends the limitations of modernism by any stretch of the imagination. And so there are lots of things that precede each other that don't necessarily result in more development. Um, and so, because I think that if we think about some of the things that postmodernism tends to emphasize, postmodernism will often emphasize things like context, for example. Well, modernism hands context very nicely. In fact, there's some theories of leadership that explicitly focus on context, like the contingency theory of leadership. Postmodernism tends to focus on subjectivity. Well, modernism handles subjectivity nicely as well. In fact, it was the introspective method that was the inception of psychology that informed this idea that we could kind of examine our own subjectivity and what have you. The key area where modernism and postmodernism often tend to disagree is about the nature of truth. And modernists will often think that truth is purely objective, and postmodernists will think that either they think that it's subjective, or question the legitimacy of objective truth, or question whether objective truth is obtainable. So I think that's kind of one of the main differences. And in fact, some of my earlier empirical research suggests that you can hold almost any worldview, including modern or postmodern worldviews, at multiple different stages of complexity. So you could be kind of a low complexity thinker as a modernist and a high complexity thinker as a postmodernist, or the opposite could happen. You could be a very high complexity thinker as a modernist and a much lower complexity thinker as a postmodernist, for example. So for me, the irony here is that, again, I think this comes back to truth, is that there's a claim on the table. The claim is postmodernism is a stage of development, above and beyond modernism, and that claim itself can be evaluated for truth. And at this point in time, my view is that this claim is entirely unfounded, and in the long run, I suspect it will probably turn out to be false.
Does this also apply to the critical social justice theory?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does too. Yeah. So critical social justice is, I mean, I would say a similar thing about that. I mean, critical social justice is partially informed by postmodernism, partially informed by particular versions of Marxism, partially informed by critical theory and what have you. critical social justice is a worldview in which we focus on groups rather than individuals or the whole of society. We think that groups are kind of suspended in this social matrix of privilege or oppression, and your relative position of privilege or oppression depends on almost exclusively your intersectional characteristics. And again, I think that the claim that critical social justice is at a higher stage of development than modernism, I think that is an unfounded claim as well.
Mm. And so, what I'm hearing then in response to that question is that essentially, yes, we do have these stages of adult development. There are various theories and work in that space. And there are also different worldviews that you've outlined previously, and your findings in your own research, but the worldviews don't have really any correlation with the stages of adult development, at least not a
Yeah,
very clear linear one, and
that's
that
right.
people
Yeah.
have worldviews across all kinds of stages of adult development.
Yeah. Well, I believe so, yes. I think for me, the key thing is that if we're in the business of doing the science or practice of complexity leadership, stages of adult development are one of many ways of approaching complexity leadership. There are some there are some stages of adult development that do explicitly look at how complexity increases from stage to stage. One of my preferred model is called the model of hierarchical complexity. I'm doing 3 or 4 research projects on it based at the moment. And so the model of hierarchical complexity does look at stages that explicitly increase in complexity and nothing else. So those types of models can be useful for complexity leadership. But if you're interested in, stuff like modernism to postmodernism, what have you, I'm not sure that you're going to make a lot of progress when it comes to complexity leadership.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we have one final question.
Oh, yeah.
And that is, so it's a bit of a slightly longer one because of how it was framed, but I think it's still important to sort of get that across. This is how the person asking the question, pardon, was articulating it. The question is, the distinction between stable traits and developmental capabilities is ongoing in my work with leaders. And this reflects back to our second episode around complexity, leadership, and different skills. So the question continues. A clear signal that someone is hitting their complexity ceiling is what happens to their communication when they start over explaining or burying the point. It's not a skills gap exactly, more like anxious thinking when the environment outpaces their current capacity to make sense of it. So I'm genuinely curious where you'd locate that. Is the capacity to stay clear under uncertainty something you see as a developable, or is it more of a stable trait side of your framework? We might just quickly revisit those stable and developable pun traits. Yeah.
Yeah, well, so the distinction I think in episode 2 we made between stable and developable traits were, stable traits are things like, personality traits, for example. So after late adolescence, early childhood, they're fairly stable, and it takes a major life trauma or something like that to really make a significant impact on stable personality traits. Developable skills are things that you can practice and get better at over time, like, getting better at serving in tennis, or getting better at asking more open-ended questions, or those kind of things that you can practice and improve over time. For me, this is an interesting one because I think there's a presupposition in this question. So let's start with isolating the phenomena that this person wants to explain. So I think what they're focused on is over-explaining something or burying the point. And it seems to me that there could be multiple ways of explaining that don't necessarily involve complexity. So
Okay, so they've suggested that over explaining or burying the point might suggest someone that is hitting their complexity ceiling, and you're sort of questioning whether that is correlated.
yeah, it could
Yeah.
be. So yeah, so over-explaining things could mean someone's hitting their complexity ceiling, but I think there's other ways of explaining it. So what I would do is say, what's the thing that I'm trying to explain? Okay, so what I'm trying to explain is over-explaining. Second is, what are multiple different ways of explaining this, or what are multiple different causes that could be contributing to this? So I brainstormed a few options, right? So explanation one. So it could be a sign of cognitive overload. and someone's finding it kind of hard to keep it together and is compensating by using lots of words to try and crystallize and stabilize their own thinking in real time. That's one option. Explanation two is maybe this person's just feeling anxious about being misunderstood, and so they keep adding in things like qualifiers and caveats and examples and stuff to try and reduce ambiguity. Explanation number three is maybe it's a sign of perfectionism, and this person feels compelled to include, every nuance and exception and what have you before they feel like they've really made the point. Explanation four is it could reflect weak message prioritization rather than complexity handling. So maybe this person hasn't really identified which information is central and which information is more peripheral, for example. Explanation five is sometimes over explaining can emerge from high conscientiousness on the big five personality factors. So when people have high conscientiousness, they often want to demonstrate more diligence or rigor and what have you, even when they could communicate things much more simply. Um, Explanation six, maybe they've kind of misread the audience and they're making assumptions that the audience lacks background, knowledge, and context, and they're trying to sort of over explain things, thinking that the audience knows less than what they actually do. Explanation number seven is maybe it does reflect some kind of intolerance towards intolerance towards uncertainty, and sometimes when people feel a bit, you know, uncomfortable with ambiguity and what have you, they continue elaborating rather than just allowing a kind of imperfect but somewhat adequate conclusion. And finally, in my eighth explanation is maybe it's got nothing to do with the person, it's about the organizational culture. So some cultures actually reward people who provide exhaustive justifications, who've defended themselves to the hilt, who've provided every bit of detailed evidence on everything. And so perhaps it's got something to do with the culture or the organizational culture that they're used to. And of course, it could be interactions between lots of these different things. So to me, I think whether it's developable or stable really depends on what's causing it. So I would say, what's the phenomena? What's the cause? Is that cause likely to be more stable or more developable? And then let's say think about, okay, what can you do about it?
Yeah, amazing. So if we're looking at the ability to stay clear under uncertainty, it
Yeah.
sort of really depends on what's driving that will influence whether it is something that can be developed or is more of a stable trait.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And look, I mean, if someone's having trouble with things like that, I think to me that does sound, I mean, this is a very superficial response based on not knowing who this person is or, how this is manifesting or whatever. But it sounds like the kind of thing that could be developable. Um,
Mm,
so in that sense, I would say there could be a few things. So point number one is I would get this person to be clear about the core point, right? So before you even open your mouth, just ask yourself, what's one thing you're trying to communicate, and then lead with that sentence, okay? Because if you're leading with your core message, then complexity can be a little bit easier to manage. Yeah. So the second thing that I would say is practice communicating in chunks. So you can say exactly the same thing in one sentence, in five sentences, in 10 minutes, in 15 minutes. So you're kind of practicing the ability to either compress or decompress the same message and explain the same thing in different amounts of time. I think that's the second thing. The third thing that I would say is it's important to separate the core message from the detail. So what's the main claim? What are the drivers in play? What are the examples and what are the caveats? So, that kind of structured way of explaining things can provide some more framing and some more clarity. Um, I think the other thing I would say is it can be really helpful to map things more visually. So instead of, kind of blurting out a word salad, say, here's my diagram, like causal loop diagram or systems map or picture or, stakeholder map or whatever that tries to explain some of the mess that I'm trying to get across. And the final thing I would say is some simple framing. So I would say something like, this is my best interpretation for now, or there's some things I'm probably missing, or here's my best framing at the moment, or something like that. Yeah.
mhm. And so it's interesting because I really like the different explanations you've provided, because I think there are two things that come to mind when I sort of also read that question. One of them is, well, actually, I think that possibly goes to the complexity leadership skill you talked about around self regulation.
Yeah.
Because if we're able to regulate ourselves, we can actually think more clearly and
Yeah.
with greater complexity. But actually, having also those explanations that you raised, that might be a factor, but also that way of thinking, as you said, it can be more just individual dependent.
Yeah.
Um, but it also could be something that is around conditioning, or it might be something that can be developed in the sense of, well, currently your thinking's a bit convoluted, but like let's help with, the approach to thinking. And I think, some of um I remember some of my there were very specific university courses that I remember I couldn't tell you anything about the content,
Yeah.
but they helped me structure how I thought. And
Yeah.
so that ability to learn how to structure our thinking and then to communicate that clearly is also something that sounds quite developable. So I guess I like how you separated it into, well, it depends what the driving factor is, but it can be a factor of thinking, and what you just listed in terms of how to structure and communicate effectively,
Yeah.
and also remaining clear through uncertainty is also potentially a self-regulation
Exactly.
element. So there could be multiple approaches.
Exactly. And so this is great. And I think you have just demonstrated a really important complexity leadership skill, which is trying to find multiple causes, exploring multiple causes rather than leaping to conclusions, right? Because self-regulation could be very effective if anxiety is the thing that's causing this person to have problems with communication. But I mean, I know plenty of people who are calm, cool, and collected, and their verbal communication is all over the place, but that's probably a communication thing or a thinking thing rather than a self-regulation thing, for example. Um, so again, this even the conversation we're having right now is part of a complexity leadership practice. Is what's the thing you're trying to explain? What are multiple possible explanations for these things so you can really get at the root cause?
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
And I think if we're to translate to the person who asked this question, or to anyone in a similar situation, whether it's someone that they manage or for themselves, it sounds like, well, that first step is really, let's understand and unpack what some of the drivers might be.
Hmm.
We might not get clarity on it, but if we can distill maybe a couple, then we can start tweaking those ones. As you said, I loved that analogy of from the Q&A last week of where do we start with complexity. It's like, well, you look at which thread you can pull that will have the biggest impact. So if we were
Yeah.
to apply that now, it's like, okay, what are some of the explanations, possible explanations? Let's address some of these. Does it have an impact? Yes, great. We'll keep addressing it. No, let's try some other ones. And so I guess that would be the same with someone that you're managing, or also if it's yourself. And then,
Yeah.
the more information you get, the more that you can sort of hone in on
Yeah.
the solutions.
I think that's awesome. Yeah, spot on. I think that's very constructive.
But I love that this is actually, a complexity leadership question, but also the process of putting it into practice as we go through the answer. I love that.
Yeah.
It's very exciting
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah, no, it's fun stuff. Yeah.
Amazing. So these were our 4 questions from the conceptual questions that we received on our 4-part mini series on rising to the occasion, really focusing on complexity leadership and its many applications. I'm not going to ask you for a summary of this one as I have done before, because that is just cruel. We've covered so much ground in this space, and I think we did tie each question off individually. But if there's something that you think people might take away from, especially probably the conversation around truth, because I feel like that's probably the trickiest and most nebulous one here, is there something that you would maybe suggest that people explore further in their day-to-day practice, or just take away for their own application in day-to-day life with a complexity leadership lens?
There's so many things. There's so many things. I would just say truth matters. I think truth is a necessary condition for doing complexity leadership. And one of my favorite questions is, how do you know that? If someone's got a great answer to how do you know that, then they're probably taking reasoning and evidence into consideration. If someone doesn't have a good answer to the question, how do you know that, then we need to think twice about what's going on.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And that's a good reflection that, I can also apply, and we can all apply to ourselves as well, of when we make claims or assertions, just ensuring that, oh, how do I know that? Where is that evidence coming from?
Yeah.
And whether it's scientific or otherwise, could be many, many different places we get that from.
Yeah.
Thank
Totally.
you so much for joining me on these 2 Q&A podcasts following up from the mini series. I've really enjoyed getting to sort of unpack some of the questions that people have had following on from the other episodes, and that's been really exciting to see that engagement and the kinds of questions that are coming through. So
Yeah.
really appreciate you taking the time to go through them in more depth.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm glad that our listeners have been, taking notes so carefully that they could come back with cool questions like this for us to talk about. So it's
Fantastic.
been a wonderful experience. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there have been many times in our conversations where there's just so much more that we can go into. So I think watch this space for further discussions and explorations on these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Life, Leadership and Change with me, Cara Hawkins. I hope it's left you with plenty to think about and to feel inspired by. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit subscribe to receive more episodes like this. And remember to leave us a review to help others find the podcast. It makes a huge difference, and it's a great place to let me know what you thought, what you loved, and what you'd like to hear more of. Thanks so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next episode.